The legend that would terrorize Tennessee for 7 years began on a winter night in January 1852, when a 28-year-old enslaved man named Moses Kaine murdered his overseer with a cotton hoe, set fire to the plantation house at Cedar Ridge, where he had been worked nearly to death for 15 years, and disappeared into the Smoky Mountains, carrying nothing but stolen weapons and an iron determination never to be enslaved again, regardless of what violence that freedom required. By 1859, when bounty hunters finally cornered and killed him in a cave high above the Tennessee Valley, Moses had become the most feared outlaw in the southern mountains, leading a band of escaped slaves and criminal fugitives who conducted raids against plantations, murdered slave catchers and bounty hunters, and created a reign of terror so effective that entire counties offered $1,000 rewards for information leading to his death, while enslaved people throughout Tennessee whispered his name as proof that resistance could succeed and that some forms of freedom were worth dying to maintain. If you're ready to discover the most incredible fugitive slave story ever told, where one man's escape from plantation hell became a 7-year war against everyone who tried to recapture him, transforming him from property into the most feared mountain warrior the South had ever faced, hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what Moses Kaine accomplished after escaping Cedar Ridge Plantation will challenge everything you thought you knew about runaway slaves, mountain warfare, and the lengths that extraordinary individuals will go to defend freedom they've chosen over the safety they've been denied. The man who would become Tennessee's most wanted fugitive had been born into slavery at Cedar Ridge Plantation in 1824, the son of parents he barely remembered because they had been sold away when he was 5 years old, leaving him to be raised by the plantation's community of enslaved people who taught him survival skills that would prove essential during his years as mountain outlaw. Cedar Ridge sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime cotton land in Middle Tennessee, bounded by the Cumberland River on one side and the foothills of the Smoky Mountains on the other, geography that would prove crucial when Moses needed terrain that favored fugitives over pursuers, and that provided hiding places where organized resistance could be sustained for years. The year was 1852, and Tennessee occupied a unique position in the slave South as a border state, where rugged mountain terrain created opportunities for sustained resistance that didn't exist in flatter plantation regions, where proximity to free territory in Ohio and Pennsylvania made escape seem more possible than in the deeper South, and where a tradition of frontier independence among poor whites sometimes created unexpected alliances with escaped slaves who shared their hostility toward wealthy plantation owners. The Smoky Mountains themselves had become refuge for various categories of fugitives, including army deserters, debtors fleeing creditors, criminals avoiding prosecution, and escaped slaves seeking freedom that seemed impossible to achieve through legal means. Master James Hartwell, 45 years old in 1852, represented Tennessee Plantation Society at its most successful and its most brutal, having built Cedar Ridge into one of the region's most profitable cotton operations through systematic exploitation of the 150 enslaved people whose labor produced his wealth. Hartwell was known throughout Middle Tennessee for his innovative agricultural techniques, his active participation in state politics, and his reputation for maintaining discipline among his enslaved workforce through violence so severe that other plantation owners sometimes privately criticized his methods as excessive even by the standards of a system built on systematic brutality. The overseer, who would become Moses's first murder victim, was a man named Samuel Blake, hired in 1850 specifically because of his reputation for controlling difficult enslaved people through methods that stopped just short of killing valuable property. Blake had been dismissed from 2 previous positions for beating enslaved workers to death, but Hartwell had hired him despite this history because Cedar Ridge was experiencing what he described as discipline problems that required someone willing to use whatever violence was necessary to maintain productivity and prevent resistance from spreading among the enslaved population. Moses himself had been marked as a potential troublemaker from adolescence because of his size, intelligence, and apparent leadership qualities among other enslaved people at Cedar Ridge. Standing over 6 feet tall, with the kind of physical strength that came from 15 years of cotton cultivation and the mental sharpness that came from secretly learning to read using discarded newspapers and overheard conversations, Moses represented exactly the kind of enslaved person that plantation owners feared most, someone who combined the physical capacity for violence with the intelligence to plan resistance and the charisma to convince others to join dangerous enterprises. The specific incident that led to Moses's decision to kill Blake and escape had occurred on January 10, 1852, when the overseer had beaten an elderly enslaved woman named Sarah to unconsciousness for working too slowly during cotton processing, then had announced that anyone who helped her would receive similar treatment. Moses had intervened to protect Sarah, creating a direct confrontation with Blake that escalated when the overseer tried to whip Moses for insubordination, and Moses had refused to submit, fighting back in a way that challenged Blake's authority and demonstrated that at least one enslaved person at Cedar Ridge was no longer willing to accept violence without resistance. The beating that Blake administered to Moses as punishment for this resistance had been so severe that it left him unable to work for 3 days, with injuries that included broken ribs, a concussion, and lacerations that required weeks to heal properly. But more importantly than the physical damage, the beating had crystallized Moses's understanding that submission would never provide safety, that Blake's violence would continue and escalate until it killed him, and that the only choice was between dying as enslaved property or living as free man, who accepted the risks that freedom required in a society dedicated to recapturing and punishing people who claimed it. The planning of Blake's murder and the escape from Cedar Ridge had consumed the 10 days between Moses's beating and the night of January 20th, when he would execute both with precision that demonstrated his intelligence and his understanding of what successful resistance required. Moses had identified Blake's routines and vulnerabilities, had stolen weapons from the plantation house, including a pistol and ammunition, had studied the geography between Cedar Ridge and the mountains to plan an escape route that would minimize pursuit time, and had prepared supplies that would sustain him during the initial weeks of mountain life when he would be most vulnerable to capture. But the murder itself was not simply practical necessity. It was also symbolic statement that Moses was no longer enslaved property, but rather free man willing to kill anyone who tried to reduce him to bondage. The cotton hoe that Moses used to crush Blake's skull while the overseer slept in his cabin was the same tool Blake had forced Moses to use during back-breaking field labor, transforming an instrument of agricultural production into a weapon of liberation that demonstrated how tools of oppression could be repurposed for resistance when deployed by people with sufficient courage and determination. The fire that Moses set to consume Cedar Ridge's main house after killing Blake was intended to destroy not just property, but also records, documents, and symbols of the plantation system that had enslaved him for 28 years. The flames that engulfed the Greek revival mansion where the Hartwell family slept, though Moses had ensured they could escape with their lives, represented both practical destruction of resources that could be used to pursue him and symbolic destruction of the social order that claimed ownership of human beings. The sight of one of Tennessee's grandest plantation houses, burning against the winter night sky, would become legendary among enslaved people throughout the region as proof that resistance could succeed and that symbols of white power were not indestructible. The escape itself began immediately after the fire was set, as Moses disappeared into the winter darkness carrying weapons, supplies, and the absolute determination never to be enslaved again, regardless of what that freedom cost him, or anyone who tried to take it away. The route he followed toward the Smoky Mountains had been planned to exploit his knowledge of local terrain while avoiding roads and populated areas where pursuers would be most likely to find him. The first 48 hours would be crucial. If he could reach the mountains before organized pursuit began, he would have opportunities to establish defensive positions and to begin building the network of allies and resources that would sustain 7 years of successful resistance. The transformation from escaped slave to mountain warrior would require Moses to master skills that plantation life had never taught him: wilderness survival in terrain where winter temperatures could kill, hunting and trapping for subsistence when stolen supplies ran out, military tactics for fighting outnumbered against better-equipped enemies, and leadership techniques for commanding other fugitives who would eventually join his band. The mountains would become both his sanctuary and his battlefield, providing protection from pursuit while demanding survival skills that would test every physical and mental capability he possessed. The legend that began with Blake's murder and Cedar Ridge's burning would grow over 7 years, as Moses demonstrated that individual resistance could be sustained indefinitely if the resistor possessed sufficient intelligence, courage, and willingness to use violence against anyone who threatened his freedom. The raids, murders, and escapes that would make him Tennessee's most feared outlaw were not random acts of violence, but rather elements of systematic warfare against a society that claimed ownership of his body and demanded his submission to violence that would eventually have killed him if he had remained enslaved. The stage was set for 7 years of mountain warfare that would prove that slavery was not the stable, controlled system its defenders claimed it to be, that individual resistance could create widespread terror among people who claimed absolute power over enslaved populations, and that someone with sufficient courage and intelligence could transform himself from property into predator, who made entire regions afraid of the violence that freedom sometimes required. The survival skills that enabled Moses Kaine to transform from escaped slave into mountain warrior during his first brutal winter in the Smoky Mountains had been acquired through a combination of knowledge passed down from enslaved elders who remembered frontier survival techniques, careful observation of Cherokee practices still maintained by Tennessee's remaining indigenous population, and the kind of desperate improvisation that becomes possible when the alternative to learning is death from exposure, starvation, or capture by slave catchers who would either kill you or return you to bondage worse than what you had escaped. The initial months from January through April 1852 tested every physical and mental capacity Moses possessed as he learned to find shelter in caves and rock overhangs, to hunt deer and small game using stolen weapons and homemade traps, to identify edible plants that could supplement meat when hunting was unsuccessful, and to move through mountain terrain in ways that left minimal traces for trackers who were searching for him throughout Middle Tennessee's rugged backcountry. The geography of the Smoky Mountains provided advantages for fugitives that flatland plantation regions could never offer, as the steep terrain created natural defensive positions where one person with weapons could hold off multiple pursuers. The dense forest provided concealment that made tracking difficult even for experienced hunters, and the numerous caves and rock formations offered shelter that could be defended or abandoned quickly, depending on circumstances. Moses had studied these mountains from Cedar Ridge's fields for years, understanding that they represented potential sanctuary if he could survive long enough to learn their secrets and to identify locations where sustained resistance would be possible. The transformation from plantation field hand to wilderness survivor required mastering skills in several critical areas that would determine whether Moses's escape resulted in brief freedom followed by recapture and death, or sustained independence that could serve as foundation for more ambitious resistance. The first critical skill involved hunting and trapping that could provide protein necessary for survival in conditions where physical exertion was constant and where stolen supplies would last only weeks. Moses had limited hunting experience from Cedar Ridge, where enslaved people were occasionally allowed to supplement inadequate rations by trapping small animals, but mountain hunting required more sophisticated skills, including tracking game through difficult terrain, understanding animal behavior patterns, and using firearms effectively despite limited ammunition that needed to be conserved for both hunting and self-defense. The second critical skill involved shelter construction and maintenance in an environment where winter temperatures could drop below freezing, and where exposure killed as surely as slave catchers' bullets. The caves that Moses identified as potential bases required modification to provide adequate protection, clearing debris, creating fire pits that could provide warmth while minimizing smoke that might reveal his position, establishing water sources, and creating defensive barriers that would slow attackers if his location was discovered. The engineering involved was primitive but effective, drawing on traditional knowledge that enslaved people had maintained across generations about creating defensible spaces in hostile environments. The third critical skill involved navigation and intelligence gathering that would allow Moses to move through populated areas, to steal supplies while avoiding capture, to identify targets for future raids, and to gather information about pursuit efforts that threatened his security. This skill required understanding of local geography beyond simple memorization of landmarks, developing networks among enslaved people and sympathetic whites who could provide information about slave catchers' movements, and maintaining situational awareness that allowed rapid response to threats before they became immediate dangers. But survival skills alone wouldn't transform Moses from individual fugitive into leader of mountain warriors. That transformation required recruiting others to join his resistance. developing military tactics appropriate for guerrilla warfare against better-equipped enemies, and establishing reputation that would both deter casual pursuit and attract fugitives seeking the kind of sustained freedom that individual escape rarely provided. The recruitment of his initial band occurred gradually during 1852 and early 1853, as word spread through Tennessee's enslaved communities that a man named Moses Kaine was living free in the Smoky Mountains and was willing to help others who had the courage to escape and the determination to fight for their freedom. The first person to join Moses was a man named Jacob, who escaped in March 1852 from a plantation adjacent to Cedar Ridge after being marked for sale to a notorious slave trader known for purchasing slaves specifically for resale to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in single-digit years. Jacob had heard through the slave quarters intelligence network about Moses's successful escape and Cedar Ridge's burning, had memorized directions to the general area where Moses was believed to be hiding, and had fled with stolen supplies and weapons, hoping to find the mountain sanctuary that rumor claimed existed. The meeting between Moses and his first recruit occurred when Jacob, lost and near death from exposure, stumbled into the cave system that Moses had established as his base, creating a partnership that would form the core of what would become Tennessee's most feared outlaw band. The expansion of Moses's group from 2 to eventually 15 core members occurred gradually over 3 years, as successful escapes and raids established his reputation and attracted fugitives with various skills and backgrounds. Some were escaped slaves like Moses and Jacob, who sought permanent freedom and were willing to accept the risks of mountain life rather than face inevitable death in bondage. Others were free black people fleeing false enslavement claims that Tennessee law made difficult to defend against. A few were white criminals and army deserters who found in Moses's band the kind of organized resistance and guerrilla warfare opportunities that appealed to their own grievances against Tennessee's legal and military authorities. The diversity of Moses's band created both strengths and tensions, as escaped slaves brought intimate knowledge of plantation operations and vulnerabilities, while white members brought weapons skills and connections to criminal networks that could provide supplies and information. The tensions arose from racial dynamics that persisted even among people who were all fugitives from Tennessee's legal system, as white members sometimes expected deference from black members, despite Moses's clear leadership, and despite the reality that they were all equally vulnerable to capture and execution. Moses's management of these tensions demonstrated leadership capabilities that went beyond simple physical courage, including diplomatic skills that maintained unity while enforcing standards of behavior that made interracial cooperation possible. The military tactics that Moses developed for conducting raids against plantations and ambushing slave catchers drew on a combination of frontier warfare traditions, slave rebellion tactics that had been passed down through oral histories about successful resistance, and his own innovations based on understanding both his group's vulnerabilities and their enemies' assumptions about how escaped slaves would behave. The core principle involved exploiting advantages that rugged terrain provided while avoiding direct confrontations where numbers and equipment would favor pursuers, using mobility and surprise to strike targets before organized response was possible, and creating psychological terror that made pursuit seem more dangerous than simply allowing mountain fugitives to remain at large as long as they didn't threaten core plantation operations. The first major raid that established Moses's reputation occurred in June 1852, when his band attacked a slave coffle being transported through Middle Tennessee en route to the Deep South, freeing 18 enslaved people while killing 2 slave traders and 1 bounty hunter who tried to defend the human cargo. The raid demonstrated sophisticated planning, including intelligence about the coffle's route and timing, tactical execution that overwhelmed guards before they could mount effective resistance, and logistical preparation for integrating freed people into mountain communities where some would join Moses's band while others would continue north toward permanent freedom. The psychological impact of the raid extended far beyond the immediate 18 people freed, as it demonstrated that slave coffles, supposedly secure transportation of valuable property, were vulnerable to attack, and that enslaved people being sold south could hope for rescue rather than accepting their fate as inevitable. The evolution of Moses's tactics over the following years showed increasing sophistication as he learned from successes and failures, developed better intelligence networks, and acquired more weapons and supplies through raids and purchases from criminal networks. The raids targeted not just slave coffles, but also plantations, where Moses had intelligence about valuable supplies or where enslaved people had requested liberation. Bounty hunters foolish enough to venture into mountain areas where Moses's band could ambush them, and occasionally towns where sympathetic merchants would trade with fugitives, or where symbolic attacks would demonstrate that Tennessee's mountain regions were effectively outside state control. The weapons that Moses's band accumulated through raids, theft, and purchases transformed them from desperate fugitives into genuinely dangerous military force, as rifles, pistols, ammunition, and eventually even a few shotguns provided firepower that could challenge slave catchers and militia units rather than simply allowing flight from superior forces. The acquisition and maintenance of these weapons required both tactical skill in capturing them and technical knowledge about firearms care and ammunition conservation that Moses learned through practice and instruction from white band members who had military experience. The psychological warfare that Moses waged against Tennessee's plantation society was as important as physical violence in creating his legendary status, as he understood that terror could be force multiplier that made pursuers hesitant and that encouraged enslaved people to believe resistance was possible. The tactics included leaving messages at raid sites warning slave catchers to stay out of the mountains, conducting attacks that maximized humiliation of plantation owners and overseers, and cultivating reputation for extreme violence against anyone who tried to recapture escaped slaves who had joined his band. The reputation was not entirely manufactured. Moses did kill slave catchers and bounty hunters with ruthless efficiency, but it was also strategically amplified through storytelling and rumor that made him seem more numerous and more capable than his actual 15-person core band. The support network that enabled Moses's sustained resistance included enslaved people throughout Middle Tennessee who provided intelligence about slave catchers' movements and planned raids, free black communities that offered temporary shelter and supplies when mountain conditions became too dangerous, criminal networks that traded weapons and ammunition for stolen goods from plantation raids, and even some poor whites whose hostility toward wealthy plantation owners occasionally translated into assistance for fugitives who shared that hostility. The network was informal and constantly shifting as people were sold away, as sympathizers were discovered and punished, and as relationships built on mutual benefit sometimes broke down when risks became too high. The economic impact of Moses's raids on Middle Tennessee's plantation economy created pressure for authorities to eliminate him that went beyond simple law enforcement concerns about fugitive slaves. The raids cost plantation owners not just the enslaved people who were freed, but also supplies stolen, buildings burned, and the increased security costs required to defend against future attacks. The insurance companies that provided policies covering enslaved property began refusing coverage for plantations near the mountains, and some slave traders refused to transport coffles through Middle Tennessee rather than risk losing valuable cargo to ambush. The economic disruption created political pressure for Tennessee's governor to authorize significant resources for militia operations against Moses's band. If this incredible story of transformation from escaped slave to mountain warrior has you completely gripped and desperate to know how Moses's raids escalated from liberating slave coffles to full-scale warfare against Tennessee's plantation system, make sure you hit that like button right now to support these extraordinary tales of resistance that operated on scales the South claimed were impossible. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss these deep dives into the most shocking true stories where individual courage created sustained military resistance that terrified entire regions. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about using violence to maintain freedom from slavery. I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives on these complex questions about resistance and survival. The stage was set for the escalation from survival and small raids to large-scale military operations that would make Moses Kaine Tennessee's most wanted outlaw as his band's capabilities grew, as his reputation spread, and as his determination to never be enslaved again hardened into willingness to wage war against everyone who participated in the system that had claimed to own him. The escalation of Moses Kaine's mountain warfare from survival raids into sustained military campaign against Tennessee's plantation system reached its apex during 1856-1858, when his band conducted increasingly audacious attacks that demonstrated not just capacity for guerrilla resistance, but genuine military capabilities that challenged state authority in ways that terrified plantation owners and forced Tennessee's governor to deploy militia says usually reserved for suppressing major slave rebellions or fighting wars against foreign enemies. The raid that marked this transition occurred in March 1856, when Moses led his 15-person corps band plus approximately 30 additional fighters recruited specifically for this operation in an assault on Hickory Grove Plantation, one of Middle Tennessee's largest cotton operations, liberating over 60 enslaved people, killing the plantation owner and his 2 adult sons when they attempted armed resistance, and burning the plantation house and cotton gin to ensure the property couldn't quickly resume profitable operations that depended on enslaved labor Moses had just freed. The planning for the Hickory Grove raid had taken 3 months and represented Moses's most sophisticated military operation to date, as he gathered intelligence about the plantation's layout and defenses, recruited additional fighters who could be trusted for large-scale operation, acquired sufficient weapons to arm the force, and coordinated timing to strike when the plantation owner's family would be present, but when most white neighbors would be too distant to respond before the raid was complete, and Moses's band had disappeared back into mountain terrain that favored defenders over pursuers. The raid demonstrated military competence that challenged every assumption about escaped slaves' supposed inability to plan and execute complex operations, proving that someone with Moses's intelligence and experience could organize resistance that matched capabilities of formal military units, despite lacking formal training or institutional resources. The psychological impact of the Hickory Grove raid extended far beyond the immediate military success, as news spread throughout Tennessee that a band of escaped slaves had successfully attacked one of the region's most prominent plantations, had killed the owner and his sons in direct combat rather than through ambush or surprise, and had liberated over 60 people while suffering only minor casualties among their own fighters. The raid demonstrated that Moses's band was no longer simply fugitives hiding in mountains, but rather organized military force capable of projecting power into the plantation heartland, where Tennessee's cotton economy was centered. The terror this created among plantation owners was profound and immediate, as people who had assumed that their wealth and social position provided security suddenly understood that they were vulnerable to violence from people they had assumed were powerless. The response from Tennessee authorities involved deploying militia forces of over 200 men, tasked with hunting down Moses's band and killing or capturing everyone involved in the Hickory Grove raid. The militia operation that followed represented the largest manhunt in Tennessee history to that date, as regular military formations equipped with modern weapons and supported by experienced trackers and scouts attempted to locate and destroy a guerrilla force that understood mountain terrain intimately and that had spent 4 years developing defensive positions and escape routes that exploited every geographical advantage. The subsequent cat-and-mouse campaign between Moses's band and Tennessee militia lasted 6 months and resulted in multiple skirmishes where Moses's fighters used terrain and mobility to inflict casualties on militia forces while avoiding direct confrontations where numbers would have overwhelmed them. The most significant engagement occurred in July 1856, when a militia unit of approximately 50 men cornered what they believed was Moses's entire band in a box canyon, only to discover that Moses had deliberately allowed himself to be cornered in a position where the canyon's walls provided perfect defensive firing positions and where the militia's numerical advantage became liability as soldiers crowded into the killing zone. The ambush that followed killed 17 militiamen and wounded 12 others before Moses's band escaped through passages they had prepared in advance, leaving the survivors to explain how a supposedly trapped group of escaped slaves had inflicted catastrophic casualties on a military force 3 times their size and equipped with superior weapons. The killing of Captain William Morrison during this engagement represented particularly significant psychological victory, as Morrison had been Tennessee's most famous Indian fighter and frontier scout, a man whose wilderness skills and tracking abilities were legendary throughout the state, and who had been specifically recruited to lead the manhunt for Moses because authorities believed his expertise would ensure success where previous attempts had failed. Morrison's death at the hands of people he had assumed were inferior in every capability relevant to mountain warfare, destroyed the myth of white supremacy in wilderness combat, and demonstrated that Moses's band possessed skills that matched or exceeded those of Tennessee's supposedly best frontiersmen. The expansion of Moses's operations during 1857 reflected both his growing confidence and his strategic understanding that sustained resistance required not just survival, but active destabilization of the plantation system that would create economic and political pressure exceeding what authorities could tolerate. The raids during this period targeted not just plantations for slave liberation, but also critical infrastructure, including bridges that cotton wagons needed to reach markets, cotton gins that were essential for processing harvests into marketable products, and warehouses where valuable crops awaited transportation. The economic damage from these raids compounded the losses from freed slaves and created situations where some plantation owners concluded that continuing operations near mountain regions was economically unsustainable even if they could maintain security. The assassination campaign that Moses conducted against bounty hunters and slave catchers who ventured into mountain regions represented systematic elimination of the people most dangerous to escaped slaves and most capable of penetrating his mountain sanctuary. The methodology involved identifying hunters through intelligence networks, studying their patterns and vulnerabilities, then conducting ambushes that ensured no survivors who could learn from their mistakes or warn others about Moses's tactics. Over 3 years, Moses's band killed at least 23 bounty hunters and slave catchers, creating such terror in this profession that bounties for Moses himself reached $5,000, an enormous sum indicating both how desperate authorities were to eliminate him and how dangerous pursuing him had proven to be. The most famous of these assassinations involved tracking and killing Isaiah Blackstone, a slave catcher whose reputation for never failing to recapture escaped slaves had made him legendary throughout the South, and who commanded premium fees for operations that other hunters considered too dangerous or difficult. Blackstone's decision to accept a $10 Zorzularo commission for killing Moses Kaine represented supreme confidence in abilities that had never failed him in 20 years of hunting escaped slaves throughout multiple states. But Blackstone's wilderness skills and tracking expertise proved insufficient against Moses's intimate knowledge of mountain terrain and his willingness to spend months stalking the hunter until perfect opportunity presented itself for ambush that killed Blackstone and the 3 assistants who accompanied him. The psychological warfare that Moses waged reached its peak in 1858 when he began leaving messages at raid sites that combined practical warnings with sophisticated political commentary, demonstrating his literacy and his understanding of the moral and legal contradictions inherent in slavery. One message left at a burned plantation house read, "This property was built on stolen labor from stolen people. Its destruction is justice, not crime." To every slave catcher who reads this, the mountains belong to free people now, and anyone who enters seeking to recapture what you never rightfully owned will die here. To every enslaved person who hears of this, freedom exists if you have courage to claim it and strength to defend it. Join us. The messages were reproduced in newspapers throughout Tennessee and beyond, creating controversy about whether publishing them encouraged slave rebellion, while simultaneously spreading Moses's fame among enslaved populations who saw him as living proof that sustained resistance was possible. But the success and expanding scope of Moses's operations also created vulnerabilities that would eventually lead to his death, as his band's growth from 15 to over 30 fighters made maintaining security more difficult. As increased visibility attracted more intense pursuit efforts, and as some band members proved less committed or less capable than the original core group. The information that would lead to Moses's final battle came from a former band member named Daniel, who had been captured during a raid in early 1859, and who purchased his life by providing detailed information about Moses's mountain bases, his defensive tactics, and his current location in a cave complex high above the Tennessee Valley. The final pursuit that converged on Moses's position in March 1859 involved over 300 militia soldiers plus civilian volunteers, coordinated by officers who had studied previous failed attempts and who understood that success required overwhelming force, multiple attack routes that prevented escape, and willingness to accept significant casualties in exchange for eliminating Tennessee's most wanted outlaw. The siege that developed when Moses's band was located in their cave stronghold represented the culmination of 7 years of resistance, as approximately 20 remaining fighters, including Moses, prepared to make final stand against odds. that made survival impossible, but which still allowed opportunity to inflict maximum casualties on attackers before inevitable death. The battle itself lasted 3 days, as militia forces attempted various approaches to the cave complex, while Moses's fighters used prepared defensive positions to make every assault costly. The casualty ratio heavily favored the defenders despite their numerical disadvantage. Moses's band killed 47 militiamen and wounded over 70 in exchange for losing 13 of their own fighters during the first 2 days of combat. But attrition and limited ammunition gradually eroded the defenders' capability to maintain resistance, and by the 3rd day, Moses and his 6 remaining fighters understood that their deaths were hours away regardless of how courageously they fought. The final assault on March 23, 1859, overwhelmed the remaining defenders through sheer numbers and willingness to accept casualties that civilian forces would have refused, as militia soldiers literally climbed over their own dead and wounded to reach positions where they could fire directly into the cave where Moses and his last companions were making their stand. The death of Moses Kaine himself occurred during hand-to-hand combat after his ammunition was exhausted, as he fought with knives and improvised weapons against multiple attackers before being shot at close range by a militia lieutenant who would later claim credit for killing Tennessee's most feared outlaw, but who would privately admit that Moses had killed 3 men during the final melee before being brought down. The recovery of Moses's body and its public display in the Middle Tennessee county seat, where he had been declared most wanted, represented authorities' attempt to prove that resistance ultimately failed and that state power would always triumph over individual rebellion, regardless of how long or how successfully fugitives fought. But the display of Moses's body also inadvertently confirmed his legend, as thousands came to see the man who had terrorized Plantation society for 7 years, and as enslaved people who viewed the body understood that Moses had died free and fighting rather than submitting to the recapture and re-enslavement that most fugitives eventually faced. The aftermath of Moses Kaine's death in March 1859 left Tennessee's Plantation society celebrating the elimination of their most feared enemy while simultaneously grappling with the uncomfortable reality that 7 years of sustained military resistance by an escaped slave had demonstrated fundamental vulnerabilities in the system they claimed was stable and secure, had cost over 100 lives including prominent plantation owners and militia officers, and had inspired escape attempts and resistance throughout the state that continued even after the mountain warrior who had proven such resistance was possible had been killed. The public display of Moses's body drew thousands of viewers who came for various reasons, white Tennesseans seeking confirmation that the terror was finally over, enslaved people wanting to pay respects to someone who had died free and fighting, and curiosity seekers fascinated by the man whose exploits had been discussed throughout the South as the most successful example of sustained fugitive resistance in American history. The immediate response from Tennessee authorities involved systematic efforts to eliminate remaining members of Moses's band and to destroy the mountain infrastructure that had supported 7 years of guerrilla warfare against the plantation system. Militia forces conducted extensive operations throughout the Smoky Mountains during spring and summer 1859, attacking cave systems and camps that had served as bases for Moses's operations, capturing or killing fugitives who had been part of his network, and attempting to intimidate enslaved populations who might have provided intelligence or supplies to mountain resistors. The campaign killed approximately 15 additional fighters and captured another 20 who were either executed immediately or returned to slavery under conditions so brutal that most died within months. But the dispersal of Moses's band also meant that survivors carried knowledge of mountain warfare tactics and guerrilla resistance strategies to other locations throughout Tennessee and neighboring states, effectively spreading expertise that Moses had developed rather than eliminating it with his death. Several former band members who escaped the militia's post-Moses operations established their own smaller resistance groups in different mountain regions, creating a dispersed network of fugitive communities that continued the tradition Moses had established, even if none achieved his scale of operations or his legendary status. The Underground Railroad conductors who operated in Tennessee incorporated lessons from Moses's tactics into their own security procedures, and the knowledge of how to conduct sustained resistance in mountain terrain became part of the oral traditions passed among enslaved communities throughout the region. The economic impact of Moses's 7-year campaign extended beyond the immediate costs of raids and militia operations to influence plantation values, insurance rates, and settlement patterns in Middle Tennessee. Properties near mountain regions sold for significantly less than comparable land in areas where fugitive resistance was less threatening. Insurance companies refused to provide coverage for plantations within raiding distance of mountains where Moses had operated, and some plantation owners relocated operations to flatter regions where resistance could be more easily suppressed, even though this meant abandoning investment in land and infrastructure. The economic analysis conducted by Tennessee officials estimated that Moses's operations had cost the state over $500 in property damage, lost productivity, and security expenses, an enormous sum that demonstrated how expensive sustained resistance could be, even when it involved relatively small numbers of fighters operating without external support. The political impact manifested in intensified debates about slavery's stability and security, as Moses's success in evading capture for 7 years while conducting effective military operations challenged claims that slavery was a secure and sustainable system. Abolitionists throughout the North cited Moses's story as proof that enslaved people possessed intelligence and military capabilities equal to any white soldiers, that the plantation system was vulnerable to resistance it claimed couldn't succeed, and that moral and practical arguments against slavery were reinforced by evidence that the system required constant military force to suppress resistance that emerged whenever circumstances allowed. Southern defenders of slavery struggled to explain how one escaped slave had terrorized an entire region for 7 years, ultimately settling on narratives that emphasized Moses's exceptional nature, while denying that his success represented broader capabilities or that other enslaved people could replicate his resistance. The cultural legacy of Moses Kaine's story took different forms in different communities, reflecting the complex and often contradictory ways that Americans understood his 7-year war against Tennessee's plantation system. For enslaved people throughout the South, Moses became a legendary figure whose name was spoken with reverence as proof that resistance could succeed, that plantation owners were not invulnerable, and that freedom was achievable through courage and determination, even when legal and social systems made it seem impossible. The stories about Moses that circulated through slave quarters emphasized his intelligence, his military skills, his success in liberating others, and most importantly, his refusal to ever submit to re-enslavement, even when that refusal required accepting death. These stories served practical purposes by providing tactical knowledge about resistance methods while also offering psychological encouragement that sustained hope in circumstances designed to destroy it. For white Tennesseans, Moses represented different meanings depending on their relationship to the plantation system. Wealthy slaveholders viewed him as terrorist, whose violence justified increased security measures and harsher punishments for enslaved people who showed signs of resistance. Poor whites who had no direct stake in slavery sometimes saw Moses as folk hero, whose defiance of wealthy plantation owners resonated with their own grievances against the economic system that benefited slaveholders while offering little to non-slave-owning whites. The complexity of white responses reflected broader tensions within Southern society about slavery's economic and social impacts that would eventually contribute to secession and civil war. The civil war that began less than 2 years after Moses's death was interpreted by many formerly enslaved people as vindication of his resistance and proof that the violence he had deployed on individual scale would eventually be deployed societally to destroy slavery itself. The parallel between Moses's mountain warfare against Tennessee plantation owners and Union Army's eventual invasion of Tennessee that would destroy the plantation system seemed to confirm that individual resistance presaged collective liberation, and that the courage Moses had demonstrated in fighting overwhelming odds foreshadowed the courage that would be required for thousands of enslaved people to escape to Union lines, to serve in black military units, and to contribute to slavery's ultimate destruction. Union officers who recruited formerly enslaved men for military service in Tennessee explicitly invoked Moses's legacy as evidence that black soldiers could fight effectively against Confederate forces despite racist assumptions about their supposed military incapability. The fate of specific individuals connected to Moses's story illustrated the various trajectories that people involved in his resistance experienced. Jacob, Moses's first recruit and closest lieutenant, who had survived the final battle by being absent on a supply mission when militia forces attacked, escaped to Canada via the Underground Railroad where he lived until his death in 1891, becoming active in efforts to assist other escaped slaves and to document histories of resistance, including detailed testimony about his 7 years fighting alongside Moses. Several other survivors of Moses's band were recaptured and returned to slavery under brutal conditions that killed most within months, though a few survived until emancipation in 1865, when they were able to share their experiences publicly. The bounty hunter who had provided information leading to Moses's final battle was killed within weeks of collecting his reward, murdered in circumstances that suggested revenge by people who viewed his betrayal as unforgivable, even though he had saved his own life through cooperation. The historical memory of Moses Kaine evolved over time as changing political and social contexts shaped how Americans understood his story. During the immediate post-Civil War period, Moses was celebrated by radical Republicans as heroic resistor, whose violence against slavery was justified by the system's fundamental evil, while white Southerners during the Reconstruction period attempted to suppress memories of his successful resistance because it contradicted narratives about slavery's stability and enslaved people's supposed contentment. During the Jim Crow era that followed Reconstruction's end, Moses's story was largely erased from official histories, but maintained in black oral traditions and in Underground Railroad narratives that documented resistance against slavery. The civil rights movement of the 1950s-1960s saw renewed interest in Moses's story as activists sought historical examples of successful black resistance to oppression, though some debate emerged about whether celebrating violent resistance was strategically wise, given the movement's commitment to non-violent direct action. Modern historians studying Moses Kaine have documented extensive evidence from militia records, newspaper accounts, court documents, and oral histories passed down through generations of descendants of Tennessee's enslaved population. The case has become important for discussions about the military capabilities of enslaved people, the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare against superior forces, the economic costs of sustained resistance, and the psychological impact of successful resistance on both oppressed populations and their oppressors. The consensus among scholars is that Moses represented exceptional individual, whose combination of intelligence, courage, and military skill was rare, but whose success demonstrated capabilities that slavery's defenders claimed didn't exist, and whose tactics could have been replicated by others if circumstances had allowed. Dr. James Crawford, a contemporary professor of African American history at Vanderbilt University, has written extensively about Moses Kaine and his significance for understanding enslaved resistance. Moses Kaine's 7-year mountain warfare against Tennessee's plantation system challenges simplistic narratives about enslaved people's responses to bondage. Dr. Crawford argues in his book, Mountain Warriors, Guerrilla Resistance to Slavery in Appalachia. He demonstrated that sustained military resistance was possible when fugitives possessed favorable terrain, when they developed sophisticated tactics, and when they maintained networks providing supplies and intelligence. His success didn't end slavery or liberate most enslaved Tennesseans, but it proved that the system was vulnerable to organized resistance, that plantation owners' claims of absolute control were myths, and that individual courage combined with military competence could create freedom that lasted years, rather than days or weeks before recapture. The site where Moses made his final stand became a memorial maintained by Tennessee's black community, who erected a marker in the 1920s that reads, "Here Moses Kaine died free after 7 years of mountain warfare against slavery, proving that some men value liberty more than life, and that resistance against impossible odds is possible when courage meets intelligence and determination. May his sacrifice remind us that freedom has always required people willing to fight for it regardless of consequences." The grave where Moses was eventually buried, after his body was removed from public display and given proper burial by people who respected his resistance, became site of pilgrimage for people seeking to honor his memory and to draw inspiration from his refusal to accept bondage, regardless of what that refusal cost. The tradition of visiting Moses's grave continued through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and into the modern era, with visitors leaving tokens of respect and speaking words of gratitude for his demonstration that enslaved people possessed courage and capabilities that slavery claimed didn't exist. The incredible story of Moses Kaine's transformation from enslaved cotton picker to Tennessee's most feared mountain warrior challenges every comfortable narrative about slavery's stability and about the supposed impossibility of sustained resistance against overwhelming power. If this 7-year saga of guerrilla warfare, tactical brilliance, and ultimate sacrifice has moved you or made you think differently about what individual courage can accomplish against systemic oppression, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with others who appreciate complex stories about resistance that operated through military means and that proved enslaved people possessed capabilities their oppressors claimed were impossible. Subscribe for more incredible true stories exploring the hidden dimensions of resistance to slavery, including cases of sustained military operations that demonstrated intelligence, courage, and tactical sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchies. These are the stories that remind us that freedom has always required people willing to fight for it, that individual resistance can inspire collective liberation, and that 7 years of mountain warfare proved that some forms of bondage can be escaped through courage that accepts death as price of liberty. Until next time, remember that the most legendary resistance sometimes comes from individuals who decide that freedom is worth whatever it costs, that slavery's claims of absolute control were always myths that exceptional people could expose, and that Moses Kaine died free after proving that sustained military resistance was possible when courage met intelligence in terrain that favored the oppressed over their oppressors.